The dust tasted of judgment. It settled on every surface, a fine, gritty powder coating the weathered planks of the trading post porch, the cracked leather of men's boots, the slumped shoulders of the women who watched from the shadows. Heat shimmered above the hard-packed earth, warping the air, making the world swim. At the center of this warped world, on a splintered freight crate, stood a girl. Her name was Alara, but no one used it. They used other words. Barren, empty, a vessel without purpose. Her head was bowed, a curtain of dark hair hiding her face from the assessing, pitiless stares. The town elder, a man named Silas, whose piety was as thin as his lips, stood beside the crate. His voice was dry, like stones grinding together. "A strong back," he proclaimed to the silent crowd. "Willing hands. She asks for nothing. Her father, a good man, asks only for a token, a price to cover her keep. She cannot fulfill a wife's primary duty, this is known. The Lord's will is a mystery, but she can cook, she can mend. Who will offer a price for a lifetime of service?" Silence answered him. It was a thick, suffocating thing. A horse stamped a hoof in the livery nearby, the sound like a gavel falling. The price started high, a hopeful fiction, then tumbled, disgraced, into the realm of barter for livestock or seed. Still, no one moved, no hand was raised. The girl, Alara, did not flinch. She seemed carved from stone, a monument to a town's quiet cruelties. Then, from the back of the small crowd, a shadow detached itself from the wall of the feed store. The man was tall, but he moved with a stillness that drew no attention. His clothes were worn, patched at the elbows and knees, but clean. His face was a landscape of its own, carved by sun and wind, and a solitude so deep it had become a part of his bones. This was Elias Thorne. A man who owned a parcel of land everyone agreed was half rock and half sorrow. He smelled of pine and dust and loneliness. He watched the girl on the crate, his eyes, the color of a stormy sky, missing nothing. He saw the tremor in her clasped hands, the rigid line of her spine. He saw not a flawed object, but a soul being ground into dust. Silas, desperate now, his voice fraying, dropped the price to an insult. A handful of coins, less than a lame horse. A murmur of pity, sharp and ugly, rippled through the onlookers. And in that moment of ultimate humiliation, Elias Thorne raised his hand. It was not a grand gesture, just a slow, deliberate lift. A sun-browned hand, calloused and capable, rising into the shimmering heat. A gasp went through the crowd. Heads turned, eyes wide with disbelief. The poor rancher? The hermit of Bitter Creek? For the barren girl? It made no sense. Silas squinted, his eyes finding Elias in the glare. "Thorne?" he asked, his voice laced with confusion. Elias gave a single sharp nod. He did not speak. His action was his word. He walked forward, his boots stirring the judgmental dust. He did not look at the crowd. His gaze was fixed on the girl, Alara, as she finally, slowly, lifted her head. Her eyes met his. In them, he saw not gratitude, not hope, but a vast, shattered emptiness. He reached into his worn leather pouch, the coins clinking with a soft, final sound. This was not a purchase. It was an answer to a question no one else had bothered to ask. Elias placed the coins, his entire worth in currency, into Silas's outstretched palm. The metal was warm from his pocket. The elder curled his fingers around them, a look of grudging relief warring with contempt on his face. "She is yours, then," Silas said, the words a dismissal. He gestured for the girl to step down from the crate. Alara moved with a strange, weightless grace, as if she were a ghost, She did not look at Elias. Her eyes were fixed on the dusty ground in front of her feet. Elias turned without a word and began walking toward the edge of town where his old horse, Gideon, waited patiently, tethered to a rail. He did not look back to see if she was following. He simply trusted that the invisible chain of the transaction would hold. He heard her footsteps behind him, light and hesitant on the hard-packed road. The sounds of the town, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the low murmur of voices dissecting his inexplicable act, began to fade, replaced by the whisper of the wind through the dry grass lining the trail. The journey to his ranch was a long exercise in silence. The sun beat down, relentless. The landscape unfurled before them, a vast tapestry of ochre, rust, and pale, sun-bleached green. Canyons scarred the earth like old wounds. Lone Mesa stood sentinel against a sky of impossible, aching blue. Elias walked ahead, leading Gideon, whose saddlebags were filled with the meager supplies he'd come to town for. Ilara trailed a dozen paces behind, a small, dark figure against the enormous backdrop. Her posture remained unchanged, head slightly bowed, shoulders curved inward, as if to make herself smaller, to take up less space in a world that had told her she was worthless. He did not try to speak to her. Words felt like stones in this place, heavy and clumsy. The silence was more honest. It held the heat, the dust, the unspoken questions, the lingering shame of the auction block. He could feel her presence behind him, a constant, quiet hum of another life now tethered to his. Hours passed. The sun arced across the sky, its heat lessening as afternoon bled into evening. The shadows of the mesas stretched long and black across the trail. Elias stopped only once, by a small, willow-choked creek. He unstrapped a canteen from the saddle and drank deeply, then refilled it and held it out to her without looking directly at her. He set it on a rock between them and turned to check Gideon's hooves. He heard the soft scrape of the metal as she picked it up, the small sound of her swallowing. She placed it back on the rock and retreated to her position. The transaction was complete. They moved on. As dusk began to purple the edges of the sky, his ranch came into view. It was not much. A small, sturdy cabin built of dark timber, a lean-to barn, a web of fences enclosing a wide pasture where a handful of hardy cattle grazed. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, a thin gray ribbon against the deepening twilight. He had left a fire banked in the hearth, a small act of foresight that spoke to a life of profound self-reliance. He had always returned to a cold, empty house. Tonight was different. The silence that awaited him now had a new shape, a new weight. It was a shared silence, and he did not yet know if that was better or worse. He led the horse to the trough, uncinching the saddle with practiced, economical movements. Ilara stood uncertainly near the porch. A ship washed ashore on a foreign land. She clutched her arms, a small gesture of self-preservation. Elias finished with the horse, giving the animal a fond slap on the neck before turning his attention to the cabin. The door creaked open, revealing a single room, Spartan and impeccably clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs stood in the center. A bed, neatly made, was tucked into one corner. Against the far wall was a smaller cot, unadorned. He gestured toward it with his chin. "That is yours," he said. His voice, unused for most of the day, was rough, like bark. She gave a short, jerky nod, her eyes darting around the room, taking in the scarcity, the order. It was the house of a man who owned little but took care of what he had. He moved to the fireplace, adding a few logs to the glowing embers. Flames licked upward, casting flickering shadows that danced on the log walls. The warmth began to push back the evening chill. He did not ask if she was hungry. He simply began to prepare a meal. He took down a cast-iron skillet, sliced salted pork into it, and placed it over the fire. The smell of it sizzling filled the small cabin, a sound of simple domestic life that felt alien and jarring in the charged atmosphere. Alara remained by the door, a statue of apprehension. She watched his hands as he worked. They were large, scarred hands, but they moved with a surprising gentleness as he sliced a loaf of dark bread. He did not seem to be a man given to waste, not of movement, not of words, not of resources. Everything he did had a purpose. When the food was ready, he set 2 plates on the table. He sat in one of the chairs and began to eat, his gaze directed at his plate. He did not command her to join him. He simply created a space for her, an unspoken invitation. For a long moment, she did not move. The fear in her was a physical thing, a cold knot in her belly. Men who paid for women expected things. They demanded. They took. But this man did nothing. He just ate his meal in the quiet of his cabin, the firelight catching the gray in his temples. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, she crossed the room and sat in the other chair. She did not lift her fork. She just sat, her hands folded in her lap, listening to the sound of his chewing, the crackle of the fire, the beat of her own terrified heart. The silence in the cabin was different from the silence of the trail. It was more intimate, contained by the 4 walls, amplified by the small sounds of life. It was a silence that demanded to be filled, yet neither of them had the words. He finished his meal, stood, and took his plate to a dry sink in the corner. He washed it with water from a bucket, his movements methodical. He did not look at her, did not acknowledge the untouched plate of food that sat before her. He was giving her time. Or perhaps he was simply living his life as he always had, and she was now a ghost within it. That night, she lay on the cot, a thin blanket pulled up to her chin, her body rigid. She listened to the sound of his breathing from the other side of the room, a slow, steady rhythm. It was the sound of a man at peace with his solitude. She wondered if she had not been bought, but merely collected, like a strange stone found on a path, brought home and set on a shelf, an object of silent contemplation. Sleep did not come. She watched the dying fire paint the ceiling with orange light, and listened to the vast, lonely wind howling outside, a sound that seemed to be coming from inside her own chest. Days bled into one another, each marked by the rising and setting of the sun and the quiet rhythm of chores. Elias rose before dawn, his movements sure and practiced in the pre-dawn gloom. He would light the fire, put on a pot of coffee, and head out to the barn. He never woke Alara, but she always woke to the sounds of his departure, the soft thud of his boots on the floorboards, the creak of the cabin door. At first, she remained on her cot, feigning sleep until the sun was fully in the sky, her fear a tight coil in her stomach. But the inactivity was a poison. It gave her too much time to think, to remember the faces in the crowd, the sting of Silas's words. So one morning, she rose with him. She did not speak, but moved to the fireplace, tending the flames while he pulled on his boots. He glanced at her, a flicker of surprise in his storm-colored eyes, but said nothing. It became their new routine. She would handle the hearth, the simple meal preparation, the tidiness of the cabin. He would handle the fences, the cattle, the hard, breaking labor of the land. They moved around each other in a carefully choreographed dance of non-interference. Their communication was a language of gestures. He would leave a bucket by the door. She would know it was for fresh water from the well. She would leave a basket of mended socks on his bed. He would wear them the next day without comment. One afternoon, while sweeping the porch, she saw something small and brown crumpled near the steps. It was a fledgling sparrow, fallen from a nest under the eaves. One of its wings was bent at an unnatural angle. Its small chest rose and fell in a rapid, terrified rhythm. Without thinking, Ilara knelt, her hands, surprisingly gentle, cupping the tiny, trembling creature. She carried it inside, found a small wooden box, and lined it with scraps of cotton from her mending basket. She tried to splint the wing with a twig and a thread, her brow furrowed in concentration. She did not know that Elias had returned from the fence line and was standing in the doorway, watching her. He saw the intense focus on her face, the delicate way she handled the wounded bird. He saw her trying to fix something broken. The image struck him with the force of a physical blow. He was thrown back in time to another small, broken thing, a wooden horse, its legs snapped off. A small hand, his son's hand, holding it up to him, his little face crumpled with a child's absolute grief. "Fix it, Papa," a voice echoed in his memory, a ghost in the silent cabin. He remembered his own clumsy, calloused hands, fumbling with glue and string, unable to make it whole again. The raw, gutting failure of it. He had failed to fix the toy, and then he had failed to fix the fever that followed months later, a wildfire that had consumed both his wife and his son, leaving him in a world of ash and silence. He blinked, the memory receding, leaving the familiar ache in its wake. He looked at Ilara, bent over the sparrow, her entire being focused on this one small act of care. He had not brought her here to fix her. He had not brought her here to be fixed by her. He had simply acted on an impulse he didn't understand, a rebellion against the casual cruelty of the world. He turned and walked away from the doorway before she could see him, the ghosts of his past swirling around him like the ever-present dust. The weather turned. The vast, blue sky began to clot, with gray, bruised-looking clouds that scuttled in from the north. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and damp earth, a welcome change from the oppressive dust. Elias spent the day securing the ranch, checking the roof of the barn, reinforcing a loose gate on the corral. He worked with a grim urgency. Ilara watched him from the cabin window, a growing unease settling over her. She knew the signs of a bad storm. In the late afternoon, he came inside, stamping the dirt from his boots on the porch. He looked not at her, but toward the darkening horizon. "Storm's coming," he said. It was the first full sentence he had spoken to her that was not a command or a simple statement of fact. It was an observation, an acknowledgement of a shared reality. A small thing, but it felt momentous. She looked out the window at the churning sky. "Yes," she whispered. Her first word to him. It was barely audible, soft as moth wings, but it hung in the air between them, a tiny, fragile bridge. That evening, the storm broke. It was not a gentle rain. It was a deluge, a furious assault of wind and water. Rain hammered against the roof like handfuls of gravel. The wind shrieked around the corners of the cabin, a mournful, angry sound. The world outside the windows was a churning chaos of blackness and lashing water. Inside, the fire roared in the hearth, a bastion of warmth and light against the tempest. Elias sat at the table, sharpening a knife with a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape, 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 a steady anchor in the storm's fury. Ilara sat in the other chair, her hands busy mending one of his shirts, the needle dipping in and out of the worn fabric. The sparrow, which she had named Pip, chirped softly from its box near the fire. The storm raged, but inside the small cabin, a peculiar peace had settled. It was the peace of a shared shelter. They were two solitary people, trapped together by the storm. But for the first time, it did not feel like a trap. It felt like a sanctuary. The conversation that had begun with his warning and her assent continued in the shared silence. It was a conversation held in the scrape of his stone against steel, the soft pull of her thread through cloth, the crackle of the fire, the roar of the wind. They were not touching, not speaking, but they were weathering it together. Late into the night, a tremendous crack of thunder shook the cabin to its foundations. The windows rattled, and a gust of wind forced smoke back down the chimney, sending a puff of soot into the room. Ilara gasped, dropping her needlework. Elias was on his feet in an instant, his hand instinctively going to the hunting rifle propped against the wall before he realized the source of the noise. He saw her wide, frightened eyes in the flickering firelight. He lowered his hand. He didn't offer empty reassurances. He simply met her gaze for a long moment, a silent acknowledgement of the storm's power. Then he went to the hearth, adjusted the flue, and the smoke cleared. He returned to his seat. She picked up her sewing. The moment passed, but something had shifted. The storm outside was a physical manifestation of the turmoil each of them carried inside. By facing it together, in the quiet solidarity of their small cabin, they had weathered more than just the rain. The morning after the storm was crystalline. The air, washed clean of dust, was sharp and cool. Every rock and leaf glittered with moisture, and the scent of wet sage and pine was intoxicating. The world felt new, scrubbed clean. Elias, seeing the change in the land, felt a change in himself. He had a thought, an impulse born of the storm's cleansing. After their silent breakfast, he led Ilara not to the barn or the fence line, but to a small, fallow patch of earth behind the cabin. It was protected on one side by the cabin wall, and on the other by a cluster of rocks. The soil was dark and rich from the rain, but stony. "This soil is hard," he said, kicking at a rock with the toe of his boot. "But it listens." He went to the barn and returned with a spade and a small cloth sack. He pressed the spade into her hands. Its wooden handle was smooth from use. Then he opened the sack. Inside were seeds, small, precious promises of life. Bean seeds, squash seeds, a few hardy herbs. "This is yours," he told her, his voice quiet but firm. He was not giving her a chore. He was giving her a domain, a place to cultivate, a place to make her own. Ilara looked from the seeds in his hand to the patch of earth, then back to his face. She saw no expectation in his eyes, no demand for success. It was a simple offering, an offering of possibility. She took the sack of seeds, her fingers closing around the small, hard kernels. For the first time since her arrival, a purpose that was not about service, but about creation, began to take root in her. The work was brutal. The ground, despite the rain, was stubborn. She spent hours clearing rocks, her hands, which had been soft and pale, quickly becoming blistered, then calloused. Her back ached. Sweat stung her eyes, but she did not stop. Each rock she removed was a piece of her old life cast aside. Each patch of soil she turned over was a new page. Elias watched her from a distance as he went about his own work. He saw her struggle, but he did not intervene. He had given her the tools and the land. The effort had to be hers. He saw her frustration when a root refused to yield, and he saw the small, quiet flare of triumph in her shoulders when it finally came free. She was not just turning soil. She was fighting a battle, and she was winning. Slowly, painstakingly, she transformed the barren patch into a place of order and potential. She built neat rows, her fingers pressing the seeds into the damp earth with a reverence she hadn't known she possessed. She watered them with buckets from the well, her movements becoming more efficient, more confident with each passing day. The garden became her sanctuary. It was the first thing she checked in the morning and the last thing she looked at before the sun went down. She spoke to it, her voice a low murmur, coaxing the seeds to life. She was a barren girl, tending a barren patch of ground, praying for a miracle. And in the quiet solitude of the high plains, under the watchful eye of a silent, lonely man, she began to feel the first stirrings of something she had long thought dead: hope. Weeks passed. The sun warmed the earth, and tiny green shoots began to pierce the dark soil of Alara's garden. Each new leaf was a victory, a small, defiant flag of life. The sparrow, Pip, his wing now healed, had taken up residence in the eaves above the porch, his cheerful chirping a constant companion to the quiet hum of the ranch. The routine between Elias and Alara had settled into a comfortable rhythm, a life built of shared space and separate, respected labors. The silence between them was no longer heavy with tension, but rich with unspoken understanding. This fragile peace was shattered one afternoon by the sound of an approaching horse. It was not a familiar sound. Visitors were rare to the point of being non-existent. Elias, who was repairing a harness on the porch, straightened up, his body instantly alert. Ilara, who was weeding her garden, froze, her hand hovering over a tender squash vine. A lone rider crested the ridge. Even from a distance, Elias recognized the self-important posture of Jedediah Croft, one of the town elders who had stood beside Silas on the day of the auction. Croft had a daughter who was once betrothed to a prosperous farmer, a man who had then shown interest in Alara before her flaw was revealed. The bitterness had lingered. Croft reined in his horse a few yards from the cabin, his gaze sweeping over the scene with open disdain. He took in the neatened yard, the smoke curling from the chimney, and his eyes narrowed as they fell on Alara, on her knees in the dirt, her face smudged, but her posture straight and proud beside her thriving garden. He looked from her to Elias. "Thorn," Croft grunted, not bothering to dismount. "The town talks. They say you lost your mind." Elias said nothing, his hands stilling on the leather harness, his knuckles white. "Paid good coin for damaged goods," Croft continued, a cruel smirk on his face. "And for what? To have her dig in the dirt like an animal?" He spat on the ground. "She has a debt to her family. Her father is ailing. Some were thinking, now that she's proven she can work, perhaps a new arrangement could be made, a more profitable one." The threat hung in the air, ugly and sharp. He was talking about selling her again. Ilara rose slowly to her feet, dirt clinging to her dress. Her face was pale, the old fear returning to her eyes. She looked at Elias, her silent plea screaming across the small yard. Elias set the harness down with deliberate care. He walked down the two porch steps and stood between Croft and Alara. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach for a weapon. He simply planted his feet and became as immovable as the mountains behind him. "There is no arrangement," Elias said, his voice low and cold as a river stone. "She is not for sale," Croft scoffed. "She is not your wife. She is not your kin. She is nothing to you." Elias's stormy eyes locked onto Croft's. For the first time, the deep, abiding loneliness in him transformed into something else, something fiercely protective. "You are wrong," he said, and the words carried the weight of absolute conviction. "She is home. Now get off my land." The command was not shouted. It was spoken with a finality that allowed no argument. Croft, a bully accustomed to deference, was taken aback by the sheer, unyielding force of the quiet man before him. He saw the truth in Elias's eyes, a truth he could not challenge. With a frustrated sneer, he wrenched his horse's reins, turned, and galloped away, leaving a cloud of resentful dust in his wake. Elias stood, watching until he was gone. He did not turn around, but he felt Alara's presence behind him, a fragile warmth at his back. The shield he had formed around her had held. After Croft's departure, the air on the ranch shifted. The quiet returned, but it was imbued with a new quality. The unspoken bond between Elias and Alara, forged in shared labor and silent companionship, had been tested by the outside world and had solidified into something akin to trust. He had defended her not as property, but as a person. He had called her home. The word echoed in the space between them, a concept they were slowly, carefully building together out of silence and respect. Ilara found herself watching him more closely, seeing past the solitary, weathered rancher to the man beneath. She noticed the way his hands, though rough, could be gentle. She noticed the deep lines around his eyes, not just from squinting at the sun, but from a sorrow he never spoke of. One evening, while tidying the cabin, she discovered a small, leather-bound book tucked away on a high shelf, covered in a thin layer of dust. It was not a ledger or a Bible. It was a book of poetry. The pages were worn, the corners soft from handling. She opened it carefully. The poems were simple, speaking of the land, the seasons, the sky. They were filled with a quiet, observant melancholy that felt like the man himself. She sat at the table, the book open before her, and began to read, her finger tracing the words. She felt as though she were being given a glimpse into his soul, a place far more verdant and complex than the rocky land he worked. Elias came in from the barn and stopped in the doorway, seeing her with his book. He had not looked at it in years, not since his wife, who loved to read them aloud, had passed. He felt a pang, a familiar ghost of pain. But then he saw the look on Alara's face, not of idle curiosity, but of deep, quiet absorption. He saw her lips moving silently, forming the words. He did not stop her. He did not reclaim the book. He simply walked to the fire and began preparing their evening meal, allowing her this private window into his past. A few nights later, a comfortable quiet settled after their meal. The fire crackled. Pip, the sparrow, was asleep in his nest outside. Ilara, who had been keeping the book of poems on the small table by her cot, picked it up. She found a page she had read many times, a poem about the resilience of a lone pine tree on a windswept ridge. Hesitantly, her voice soft and a little shaky at first, she began to read it aloud. "The wind," she began, "makes no apology for its strength. The stone makes no apology for its silence." Elias, who had been mending a bridle, stopped his work. He looked at her, his expression unreadable in the firelight. She continued, her voice growing stronger, more confident with each line. The words filled the cabin, weaving a tapestry of shared feeling. She was giving his own forgotten feelings back to him, voiced by the girl everyone had called empty. When she finished, the silence that fell was profound. It was not empty. It was full of the poem's meaning, of her courage in speaking it, and of his quiet astonishment in hearing it. The world had labeled her barren, a vessel that could not create life. But here, in the flickering light of his hearth, her spirit was proving to be one of the most fertile things he had ever known. Summer deepened, turning the high plains into a furnace. The air grew thick and heavy, and the grass in the pastures turned the color of old straw. The sky was a hazy, bleached white for days on end, and the threat of fire hung over the land like an executioner's hood. Elias was on edge, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for the telltale wisp of smoke. He kept buckets of water filled and placed strategically around the cabin and barn. Alara, too, felt the tension. Her garden, her small patch of defiant life, was vulnerable, its leaves curling in the oppressive heat despite her constant watering. The threat came on a blistering afternoon. A dry lightning strike miles to the west had sparked a flame in the tinder-dry wilderness. Fanned by a hot, relentless wind, it grew with terrifying speed, a creeping orange line on the horizon that swelled into a monstrous, smoke-belching beast. Elias saw it first. a dark plume of smoke rising into the white sky. "Fire," he said, the word, a flat, hard stone in the quiet air. There was no panic in his voice, only a grim, focused urgency. The time for preparation was over. The time for fighting was here. Adrenaline surged through Alara, cold and sharp. All the fear she had felt on the auction block was nothing compared to this primal terror. But as she looked at Elias, saw the resolute set of his jaw, his fear was burned away by a different kind of fire, the will to protect what they had built. They worked without speaking, a seamless unit born of months of silent cooperation. He soaked burlap sacks in the water troughs, while she released the few panicked cattle from the corral, driving them toward a rocky, barren creek bed that might serve as a firebreak. The sky turned a sickening shade of orange-brown. Ash began to fall like a filthy snow. The roar of the approaching fire was a physical presence, a deep, guttural sound that vibrated in their bones. They took up their positions between the fire and the cabin, their faces grim, their hands clutching the wet, heavy sacks. The heat was a physical blow, stealing the breath from their lungs. Embers carried on the superheated wind, rained down around them, starting smaller spot fires that they rushed to beat out with their smoldering sacks. They moved back and forth, stamping, swinging, their lungs screaming for clean air, their eyes streaming from the smoke. In the heart of the chaos, Ilara glanced at her garden. A flying ember had landed among the squash vines, which erupted in a flash of flame. A cry of despair escaped her lips. For a second, she was ready to abandon the fight, to let the inferno take it all. But then she saw Elias, a silhouette against the wall of fire, beating back the flames that were licking at the corner of the barn. He was not giving up. He was fighting for this place, for their home. Her resolve hardened. The garden was just a thing. The home was the foundation. She turned her back on her burning creation and rejoined him, fighting with a ferocity that matched his own. They fought for hours, a desperate, two-person army, against a force of nature. They fought until the wind shifted, until the fire, having consumed all the fuel in its path, began to burn itself out, leaving a blackened, smoking wasteland in its wake. They had saved the cabin. They had saved the barn. They stood together as twilight fell, leaning on each other in their exhaustion, covered from head to toe in soot and grime. They looked out over the scorched earth, the air thick with the smell of char and ruin. Everything was black, but their small homestead stood intact, an island in a sea of devastation. The old world had been burned away, and in the smoldering silence, they were all that was left. In the days that followed the fire, a profound quiet settled over the ranch. The land was a study in black and gray, silent and still under a smoky sky. The chirping of Pip the sparrow was gone, as were the calls of the coyotes and the hum of insects. All that remained was the whisper of the wind over the charred earth. Yet, the silence between Elias and Alara was not one of loss. It was the deep, restful quiet of survivors. They had faced the worst together and had endured. The shared trial had burned away the last vestiges of their former lives, the last echoes of the town's judgment and his old grief. They were no longer a rancher, and the girl he had bought. They were two people bound to a place they had defended with their own hands. They worked to clean up the aftermath, their movements slow and weary but synchronized. They repaired the scorched corner of the barn. They cleared away the blackened skeletons of brush near the cabin. Alara surveyed the ruins of her garden, a patch of black ash where there had once been so much life. She felt a pang of sorrow, but it was shallow, fleeting. The garden had served its purpose. It had taught her to cultivate, to nurture, to believe in the possibility of life from barrenness. Now, a new lesson was taking root. One evening, after a long day of work, They sat on the porch steps, watching the first stars begin to prick the smoky veil of the sky. The air was cool and smelled of charcoal. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They simply shared the immense, silent space of the evening. Then Elias lifted a hand, not in a bid, but in a gesture of teaching. He pointed toward a cluster of stars low on the horizon. "There," he said, his voice soft in the twilight. "That's the hunter. And the belt. My father taught me their names. He said they were guideposts, said if you knew the stars, you were never truly lost." He began to trace the constellations with his finger, naming them one by one. The Great Bear, the Serpent, the Maiden. He told her the simple stories his father had told him, tales of gods and animals and heroes painted across the vast, dark canvas above. He was not just sharing knowledge. He was passing on a legacy. Not a legacy of blood or property, but of belonging. He was giving her a map to this world, making her a part of its story. Alara listened, her gaze fixed not on the glittering sky, but on his face. She saw the fire's memory in his soot-stained skin, but she saw the stars reflected in his eyes. She saw the deep well of his loneliness, but she also saw the quiet strength, the profound kindness he tried so hard to conceal. She saw a man who had raised his hand not to own her, but to save her. In that moment, she understood. He had not just given her a home, he was her home. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out. Her fingers, calloused now from work, and soot-stained from the fire, brushed against the back of his hand. It was the first time she had initiated contact. His hand was warm, steady. He stopped speaking, but he did not pull away. He simply turned his hand over and let his fingers rest against hers. They sat there for a long time, hand in hand, two solitary souls under a canopy of ancient stars, no longer lost. Autumn arrived, painting the surviving foliage in the creek beds with strokes of gold and crimson. The air grew crisp, and the sky, finally cleared of smoke, returned to its deep, piercing blue. The burned land around the ranch began to show the first tentative signs of recovery. Tiny shoots of green pushed their way through the blackened soil, a testament to the land's stubborn will to live. Life was returning. One morning, Alara was clearing the ash from her ruined garden plot when her hoe struck something soft. She knelt and brushed the soot away. There, buried deep beneath the scorched surface, were a few hardy potatoes, their skins singed but their insides protected by the earth. They had survived the fire. She dug them up with a reverence reserved for jewels. A little farther on, she found a single squash, tough-skinned and misshapen, that had been shielded by a large rock. It was not a bountiful harvest. It was a meager, scarred, and miraculous one. That evening, she took her unlikely treasures into the cabin. She scrubbed the potatoes clean, their white flesh a stark contrast to her still-stained hands. She carefully sliced the squash. She combined them with the last of the salted pork and some wild herbs she had found growing by the creek. She prepared a meal not of scarcity, but of celebration. She set the table with the 2 plates, the 2 forks. The small cabin filled with the rich, earthy smell of roasting vegetables, a scent of life and sustenance. When Elias came in from his work, he stopped, his gaze falling on the simple feast laid out on the table. He looked at the roasted potatoes, the golden squash. He looked at Alara, who stood by the hearth, her face glowing in the firelight, a quiet pride in her eyes. He sat down at the table. She sat opposite him. They ate in their customary silence, but this silence was different. It was not the silence of strangers, nor the silence of comfortable companionship. It was the sacred silence of communion. They were sharing a harvest wrested from ash and ruin. They were consuming the proof of their own survival, their own resilience. When the meal was over, Elias looked across the table at Alara. He saw the girl from the auction block, the frightened sparrow, the determined gardener, the fierce firefighter. He saw the woman who had read poetry aloud and filled his silent house with a quiet strength. He saw the person who had reached for his hand under a sky full of stars. And for the first time since a fever had stolen his world, Elias Thorne smiled. It was not a small, fleeting thing. It was a deep, true smile that started in his soul and reached his storm-colored eyes, crinkling their corners and filling them with a light that outshone the fire. It was the smile of a man who had found his way home. The barren girl and the lonely rancher, two people the world had deemed empty, had found in each other a harvest more precious than any field could yield. We often mistake barrenness for a lack of life. We look at a silent person and assume an empty heart. We see a fallow field and assume it is dead. We are a people quick to judge the surface, to measure worth by what is produced, by what is loud and visible and easily counted. But some life is quiet. It grows in the dark, in the hard, stony soil of a wounded soul. It is nurtured not by grand declarations, but by a raised hand in a silent crowd, by a shared meal in a storm, by the fierce, unspoken promise to stand as a shield against the world's cruelty. A life is not barren because it does not yield what is expected. It is barren only when it is devoid of kindness, of courage, of hope. Elias and Alara, in their shared solitude, discovered a different kind of fruitfulness, one that blossoms in the space between two people who choose to see the value in what the rest of the world has thrown away. They remind us that the most profound harvests are often the ones that grow, against all odds, from the ashes of what was lost.